Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Shark Trust podcast, the podcast where we go behind the scenes into shark conservation, about how it works and what we do. And today we are joined by the Director of Conservation at the Shark Trust, Ali Hood. Welcome.
Hi.
Ali, could you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and kind of what it is that you do at the Shark Trust?
Oh my goodness. Well, my name is Ali Hood. I've been at the Trust for over 20 years now. I think I started in 2002. When we weren't here in these fantastic offices, we were across town near the National Marine Aquarium. What do I do? Well, my role in the Trust has evolved over the years, really depending on the growth in our staff base, the nature of the campaigns and projects that we've been involved in. When I started with the Trust, there was 3 of us, and our work was fairly focused on the UK and some European issues. When I first came in, it was the height of working on the European shark finning regulation, that first shark finning regulation, which was really, really pivotal in terms of how management went from then on in. And then our work really just expanded along with the staff base. And so I find myself now working, dealing with a lot of issues in international fisheries, working with the regional fisheries management organisations. Those are the high seas bodies that theoretically govern and control shark fisheries at the high seas. I work on some of the wildlife treaties like CITES and CMS, on European fisheries issues, and a whole host of issues across our entire team. And so, offering oversight and input, funding. Being a relatively small organisation, you need to engage across the board, which means work stays really interesting and challenging, which is great.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And if we take you back, not a long period of time, obviously, but take you back to when you did start and those first kind of early steps where you're talking about the finning regulations. Yeah. Could you kind of tell us a bit about kind of shark conservation at that point in time? Because obviously it's changed over the years.
Oh, hugely, really dramatically. And I think it's really important for people to appreciate where shark conservation came from as little as 15, 20 years ago. And perhaps one of the things to appreciate there is why the Shark Trust was formed. So there was an appreciation within some of the UK statutory agencies, so things like Scottish Natural Heritage, Natural England, that there was a need for a campaign. There was a need for an independent voice for sharks, skates, rays and chimera. Chimera don't feature so heavily, but the sharks, skates and rays. And some of the conservation charities came together, like WWF, along with these statutory agencies. And from this, the sort of concept of the Shark Trust was born. At the time, there was a question as to whether this was a campaign or an organisation. Now, seeing as we're still here some 25 years plus later, clearly, we were an organisation and we still have a great deal more to do. But at that initial time, it was about creating this independent voice for sharks in an environment where there was little to no management. So, whilst the management we have today is far from perfect, it's a vast improvement on what the situation was at that time. There was limited, very, very limited tax and quotas, so quantitative management for commercially targeted or commercial bycatch species. There was no finning regulation. So some of those fundamentals that we take for granted today didn't exist at that time. So we were born into an environment where there was a great deal of work to do and achieve.
And it's kind of, incredible like how it kind of evolved. And when it was formed, like the Shark Trust became who they were back in 1997. Yeah, sorry. What were those first kind of early campaigns? Like you said about like the finning regulation, how did that work? Because you didn't really did you have like a blueprint or like a template to base it off? Because it hadn't been done.
No, I mean, that's true. And you have to appreciate that even though I've been at the Trust for over 20 years, I wasn't there at the very, very beginning. So I came into some of those processes, and the finning campaign was pushed forward through the Shark Trust and Wild Aid with the assistance of some of the, members of the European Parliament, because in those days we had UK members of the European Parliament. And this campaign was brought forward. Now, it is a legislative process, but legislative processes are often benefit significantly from demonstrations of public support, and whether that's petitions or particular sort of stunts as such, things that draw attention, capture media attention, demonstrate that there's an interest from the constituency. So all the members of the European Parliament are elected. If they find that their their constituents have a concern, this is when they may start to listen. So you need a scientific case for something, which clearly there was a strong case for the need for shark finning regulation. And there was also then a level of public pressure that came with that. And in fact, that's where my association with the Trust started before I was actually working with the Trust, was in part of that initial campaigning activity.
Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because it is one of my favourite stories of what you did at the Shark Trust, because it's so different to what I see you do now.
I know, and I thought you were going to go to that one. So I'm a really keen cyclist, and way back in the early 2000s, I was doing a lot of distance cycling, a lot of competitive cycling, and owned a variety of bicycles, many of which I still own today. And I had a tandem, and I was working at the Marine Biological Association here in Plymouth, and ended up in a conversation with Clive James, who was the then CEO of the Shark Trust, and happened to mention that I had a tandem, and his eyes lit up, and he was like, "Oh, we want to take a life-size model of a shark," and it was a black-tip reef shark, from the Houses of Parliament to the European Parliament as part of the finning campaign. Will you put it on a trailer and tow it behind your tandem? And it sounded like a great laugh. So yes, it was something that I was keen to do. And a group of us, with coming out of London with the assistance of some local bicycle courier guys, which was absolutely fantastic. We started from in front of the London Aquarium, went round Westminster Square a couple of times, which in London traffic was quite surreal and quite scary. So we were about, 6 metres long in total, with the tandem and then the trailer and the shark had its fins attached, which were wider than the bike, and going through London traffic with this shark on the back. And we cycled up to, I think we went to Harwich and went across on the ferry, and just met people on the way, did media on the way, talked to people about what we were doing, raised funds. Met some cyclists over in Holland, and we came down through Holland into Belgium, and ended up at the European Parliament, and got there with the fins still attached to the shark, which, if you've ever ridden on a cycle path in the Netherlands, you'll know there's lots of bollards to stop traffic, and lining up that shark in the gap between the bollards was quite an achievement. But it was fantastic, and it was just one of those surreal opportunities in life, but it opened this world of the need for shark conservation to me, as someone who'd been working in other areas, more benthic marine conservation, and that start of that political process. So gaining a small understanding as to what's required to change legislation, and having that opportunity to go to the European Parliament at that time, and then leaving this shark model balanced on the in-tray of one of the MEPs, as Chris Davis, balanced on the top of the in-tray of one of his assistants, and just leaving it and walking away. And it was quite poignant, because we kind of become quite attached to the shark.
And you were kind of saying before, like, gaining that kind of public support as well. Do you think did you know about that before? Or do you think that moment when you were cycling with this huge shark behind you?
Well, the importance of public support as a facet of a campaign.
Yeah.
Possibly. The work I've been doing before was more scientific as such. So I've been working as one of the initial staff members of the Marine Life Information Network at the MBA. Prior to that, I'd done some work with the British Antarctic Survey up in Cambridge, and public campaigning wasn't part of those work areas. In fact, they're not organisations that campaign in that fashion, definitely not the MBA. But from the perspective of changing legislation, the public input, that public element, is a key facet. So you need to have your well-formed scientific case. You need to have your petitions into that legislative process, and then adding to that layer of public engagement, public concern, and making sure that public concern is well briefed. So what they're asking for and what the public expectation is real, is really, really important, and is definitely part of what we would consider a well-rounded campaign or activity going forward. Some issues, the public element isn't there and isn't required, but issues that are It's not just the ones that are easier to explain, because that's wrong, but those issues, there are those issues that really benefit from that weight of public support, and finning regulation is most definitely one of those, and we've seen that at key sort of points throughout our life as an organisation, where the first finning regulation had loopholes and was weak. So through various pathways that has been improved over time, and at each of those moments the public have been involved and have been a key element of that process.
And when you say like each kind of level of those, could you talk a little bit of kind of about the process of getting those in place? Because that shows that it is a long process. You have all these elements at the start that come in, like getting that scientific information, getting the public support and the petitions in, but then it's still going to be a while to come through.
So I think it's really important to appreciate that even if you have the best available science and the most well-honed argument for a situation, then politics comes into play and economics comes into play. So there are other stakeholder groups who have potentially differing opinions. And if we're looking at something to do with fisheries, then you have a very strong lobby from the fishing industry who have a big economic incentive for perhaps a different level of regulation to what we would see as ideal from a conservation perspective. And so what you end up with is going to be some level of compromise between conservation need, or is often going to be some level of compromise between conservation need and economic pressure. And so that first finning regulation, although if you read the actual legislative text, it discusses not removing shark fins, which is, we have fins naturally attached now. That original legislation had, in essence, fins naturally attached written into it, but then it had the opportunity to take exceptions to that. And as a European member state, you could apply for a permit, a special fishing permit, which then permitted you to remove shark fins at sea and then to manage that fishery under a rather complicated fin to carcass ratio. And I won't go into all the details of that because, it's complex and long, but happy to talk about it in another podcast. But the key thing with the fin to carcass ratio is it's very, very hard to enforce. So we ended up with a scenario whereby the initial legislation was strong, but it was then weakened by these clauses, these exemptions. And that then left us with a scenario where we needed to improve that. And that's where things like the Shark Alliance campaign came into play around 2005, 2006, which brought together a very large coalition of interest groups across Europe. The Shark Trust was one of the steering group members of this, and we looked at something called the Community Plan of Action for Sharks and then the tightening of the shark finning regulation. And that was a real milestone and pivotal moment for us as an organisation, was engagement with that particular campaign.
And while we're on the kind of subject of shark fins, with those kind of that process of it coming through, where are we kind of at now?
Where are we at now? So the Shark Alliance campaign that I just mentioned, the successful objective of that campaign was to secure fins naturally attached as a requirement for European vessels worldwide. And, what we must consider there is the European fleet is vast and fishes in every ocean basin around the world. So that's a very significant win, is to secure fins naturally attached for the European fleet. And then also for any other third country vessels fishing in European waters. So that was secured in 2013. It was reviewed in 2016, and where we are now is that the European fleet is still required to land fins naturally attached. This best practice, it's widely recognised that fins naturally attached is best practice. It means that a shark is landed to its first point of landing with its fins still attached to the carcass. So there is no room within that process for finning of that shark or high grading of those fins where you land a carcass with bigger fins associated to it. There's all sorts of different issues that can go on there. It means from a fisheries management perspective that the shark can be identified and we can have a better concept of what's being landed from certain populations, but also from an enforcement perspective. If an EU vessel lands into a port in, say, Southern Africa, the port authorities there can simply see if anything untoward has occurred. So if they look at the landings, they can see if those sharks are landed with their fins attached or not. If it's not, then that's a breach. So it's a much simpler regulation to enforce, which is really important. And this has now been adopted by a number of these regional fisheries management organisations, these high seas bodies that encompass multiple countries. So that's in the Mediterranean, in the Northwest Atlantic, in the Northeast Atlantic. And there are various other slightly weaker measures that have been adopted elsewhere. And we're constantly looking to increase the adoption of fins naturally attached as a standard. And ICASs, so that's the Atlantic RFMO, tuna RFMO, we have a vast majority of support in this RFMO for fins naturally attached. There's just a couple of countries who are holding out, and we're working with a very much of a focus with a number of key parties to shift these blocks and see fins naturally attached adopted in the Atlantic fisheries, all of the Atlantic fisheries as well. So it's something that's a gold standard. It's something that should be done with no exceptions. And it is that bedrock, that fundamental to effective fisheries management. So it's an element of overfishing. So it's not a solution in its own right, because we have significant meat trade now. So finning and shark fins are not the only reason that sharks are retained. And it's really important that the narrative for sharks moves on from where it was, say, 20 years ago, when the fins were a greater driver for the retention of sharks, to today, where the fins and the meat, and in fact the meat, is increasing in terms of the volume in trade. You look at issues of food security, you look at issues of the decline in other previous target species, even improved management in other target species like swordfish or tuna could cause an increase in the retention of sharks in order to maintain the sort of economic viability of those fisheries. And we now, when we talk about finning regulation, need to see it in the context of the other drivers on those fisheries, the other drivers in terms of the retention of the sharks. And so regulating shark finning is a fundamental aspect of addressing overfishing as a whole.
Yeah, I think, kind of showing that, so overfishing being the biggest threat for sharks, and that kind of evolution over the years. And has that kind of evolution kind of followed into the jobs and the type of things you do?
I would say so. People always joke about how complex what we do is. And it is, and that's just a fact. You can take a very simple message, but that message may well mask the complexity and layers of process and the longevity of that process for several species. And so a lot of what the Shark Trust has done over time has been to sort of put those fundamentals in place, whether that's species identification. I mean, frankly, if you can't identify it, how can you report it? How can you manage it effectively? And so if you roll back to the early 2000s, mid 2000s, we produced a lot of very good, high quality identification materials that we made freely available to the fishing industry, to the enforcement sector. We translated into other languages, and we said, right, now you know what it is. And then as an increase in shark and ray regulation came into place, and there was a real groundswell of this through the sort of 2009, 2010, 11 period, where more species were listed on the tax and quotas process through the European Commission, and we were seeing more species gain other protective measures. It became more and more important to then inform the industry and the enforcement sector about which species are actually protected, where are they protected. And so as the Trust, we produced something we call fisheries advisories, which was simple single species products that said, hey, this species is now protected or managed in these sea areas. And those, again, freely out to industry, freely out to enforcement sectors, just to help with the process of understanding this is what the species is, this is what its regulation is. Now let's work on compliance with these regulations. And so, we've worked through a number of those aspects, which then allows us to start working on the more complex issues because those fundamentals are in place. And, you know, not unfortunately, because it's what keeps us interested, the landscape for shark conservation has got more and more complex with different influencing factors, whether that's climate change or food security or otherwise. And all of those then create a more complex set of factors that are actually driving that issue of what the pressures are, what the threats are to different shark populations, and then therefore what the solutions need to be. And we take time working with colleagues, working with our trusted partnerships like the Shark League to find those solutions that are best fit for those processes.
And kind of going back to kind of what you said at the start of that bit, where you're saying like creating these kind of ID guides as kind of like the basis, because those were created ages ago and a lot of them are still used today, and it kind of shows the kind of difficult, like people still find it difficult to ID sharks and rays because there's obviously they're such a diverse species. There's over 1,200, and with the kind of development of these fisheries advisories, because they're updated quite regularly, people think, oh, this has been put in place, so everyone's going to kind of know it. But these big decisions are made. But if you're working in that industry, or even as an enforcement officer enforcing that, you're not necessarily going to know everything because the commercial fisheries are so large.
Absolutely, and that was in part what we recognised, is that enforcement officers and industry, they have, yes, they're informed. They're obviously informed of changes to licence conditions. The government will provide them with documentation on what those legislative changes have been on an annual basis. But the focus may well be on those bigger catches of higher value commercial species, well, not higher value necessarily, but the primary commercial species. So it may be cod, or it may be, a whitefish or a traditional bony fish. So historically, the sharks and the rays have been lower down that list of priority. And, our job is to bring them up, is to elevate them. And so what we did through the fisheries advisories was to say, hey, there's this set of species, they're now protected. They may not be on your radar immediately because you're looking at, huge issues of landings of X and Y, but this will help you if one of these comes across your market, or if, an unusual. We know they're used today. We have people contact us from the marine management organisation saying, we used your materials, we found this species, can you confirm the identification? And so, also establishing ourselves as a centre of expertise where people can come to and just check those identifications, aid that compliance process. And it's all circular. We're constantly learning. We're feeding that back into that process, and we're enabling, to the best of our ability, industry or enforcement to keep up to date with what the changes are, those legislative changes are. And the identification materials, we're learning more and more about these species. It may be that the original type specimens that we used for the illustrations, 15 years ago, actually, more has been learnt about that species, and they're adapted and changed. Their status, their conservation status may have changed. And so we do also update our identification materials at the best of our ability. Digital content is great because it enables us to keep things up to date, online at least. But it's really important, we feel, to provide that assistance, and also then take away the ability for someone to say, I didn't know that was a threatened species or a protected species. Well, we provided the materials, we showed you clearly. We have posters, we have material as far south as the Falklands in Korean, Spanish and English, showing them all the different skates that they capture within the fisheries there, helping, wherever we can. But some of these approaches have then been adopted by other agencies. So we've recently worked with the Marine Stewardship Council on a product for ETP species, so that's endangered, threatened and protected species. And they've chosen to take our approach with the advisories and mirror that into into other taxa, and that again has been a credit to the sort of work that we've done, because people have said, oh, this makes sense. It's not rocket science, but it makes sense to just go, these species are also protected or managed, and you need to be conscious of this when you're when you're landing or catching on. These are the species that need to be returned. These are the species that need to be reported. And that's another key thing that we're very keen on, is ensuring that people and the industry understand the importance of reporting their bycatch and their discards, particularly for these threatened species.
Yeah. And with that kind of, because it's like digital, we can update it kind of all the time. I think it's quite important to talk about how these bits might be put in place because the species might be threatened, but we're science-based, so we keep on top of this, and that can then go back the other way.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you see, it is really important to keep on top of status of a species, and to recognise and celebrate where there is a change, hopefully a positive change in a population status. Sharks, skates and rays being long-lived, those changes take time. For some species, a very long time. But the Shark Trust, having been in place for over 25 years, we have seen in that time, we have seen some species decline, but we've also seen some species under strict management show those first tentative signs of recovery. Tentative, but we should celebrate tentative. We should also then work to protect and nurture that, and make sure that the way legislation perhaps changes, or the way that population is then perceived as a fisheries opportunity, that's not done in a manner that is going to threaten that tentative recovery. Sharks, skates, rays need space, they need room, they need time in which to recover to levels at which a sustainable catch could be possible. And for some species, that's not going to be possible. And so for us as well, it's really important that we look at each of these species as individuals. It's not sharks and rays. It's individual species that have individual needs. Now, that's not always possible. But if we look at, for example, the work in the Atlantic that we do with ICATs, the RFMO for the Atlantic, for the tuna RFMO for the Atlantic, you've got blue shark and you've got mako, both of which are caught in the same fishery. Mako, the population status is at such that it needs a prohibition. It needs, zero mortality. When you say zero mortality, that's not just zero landings. It's getting the mortality of bycatch, of post-release, discards, just the whole level of mortality down to the lowest possible level. And that's a really, really challenging thing to achieve, but it's essential for the future of that species in that sea area, that is effort. All efforts are made to achieve that. Whereas blue shark, yes, it's a heavily fished species. Again, something that's only recently secured management for, and the Shark Trust with our Shark League colleagues were, at the front end of that process. Again, something that took a very long time. But that's a species that has a slightly faster life history strategy, and it has the capacity under effectively managed conditions to be a significant contributor to aspects of food security and to maintain a sustainable fishery. So we have one species that could, under managed conditions, effectively managed conditions, have a sustainable fishery, and we have another species within the same, caught it within the same fishery, that needs that highest level of protection. And so it's balancing those issues that's quite challenging.
And with kind of being at the front line of that, so that was part of the No Limits campaign, which is the first campaign I ever heard of about shark conservation. Is what kind of got me into it. And it was such a long process. I mean, to me, that seems like there may be even longer ones.
That was only 5 years. That wasn't very long.
But could you talk about that kind of, because that's international fisheries for these species?
Yeah. We talked earlier about the value of a public campaign as an aspect of securing legislative change. And No Limits was a public campaign. There was an awful lot of advocacy activity that was in place already, that was ongoing. And, that advocacy activity benefited from that vocal support from the No Limits campaign, which then aligned with work that we were doing with the Shark League, with our colleagues from Shark Advocacy International, Ecology Action Centre and Paddy Aware. And we generated significant support, particularly from across Europe, because it's the European vessels, particularly those vessels from Spain and Portugal, that catch the lion's share of blue shark and mako in the Atlantic. So we needed to focus, whilst addressing many of the other 52 odd parties to ICAT, we needed to focus a lot of our public efforts on the EU, on the EU Commissioner, on ensuring that there was an understanding that the EU has such capacity to do good in these fisheries situations. So you then have to consider that the EU or EU stakeholders in the shape of the fishing industry also have a huge economic interest and a massive vested interest in maintaining either the status quo or limits that are not impeding their ability to fish at a level which they see as appropriately profitable.
And with kind of working in that, like going to ICAT, working with organisations in the Shark League, and kind of doing that support, you said they're like 52 parties, like it's the Atlantic.
Well, it's not just the Atlantic, it's also distant water fleets. So you have Atlantic nations, and then you have Japan, China, Taiwan. You have a whole host of other countries that have interest in fishing in the Atlantic.
And what is it like being the kind of, because that's a lot. That's a lot.
Europe's one party, and that has 27 member states. So yeah, it is a lot. I mean, it's a very concentrated way to reach, through the RFMOs, is a very concentrated way to reach a lot of countries, because you have, and they all have differing interests in different species, in different scenarios. So it's a valuable opportunity for us, and one of the things that's fundamental to understanding all of this, that our advocacy work is science-based. We have mentioned this, but it's really, really important. So the briefing materials that we produce, either as the Shark Trust or as in a campaign such as the Shark League, are as well informed as they can be, using best available science. We engage not just in those annual meetings where you have all of the parties there, but also in what are called the intersessionals. So throughout the year, there are many meetings that address some of the nuts and bolts of the bigger process. So you have your science meetings, you have your stock assessment meetings, and what's fascinating in these RFMO processes is that the people that are engaged at the sort of science end are not necessarily at the annual meetings, where that's very much a political fora and you have a different set of people. So for us, it's important to have engaged throughout the process, because you understand the evolution, the anatomy of the material that's then presented in to that annual meeting. So you understand why a statement was made, or why a particular position, or which country perhaps influenced an assessment more than another country through the provision of data and all of these things. And for me, it enables us to be fully informed. And when we then go into those annual meetings, we can perhaps be more, we can be more constructive, and we can provide more nuanced briefing to other parties who may be keen to support a particular position or a particular proposal that a proponent, so another party, has put forward. So it's the countries that put forward the proposals. We will obviously work with countries to encourage proposals to go forwards, or to provide supporting information to other countries to understand why that proposal is something that should be supported. But we don't only engage with countries that we know are supportive. We also work to change the positions and opinions of those countries that are perhaps not so keen to engage on a particular topic, and demonstrate to them why engaging on shark conservation may well be important for their swordfish or their tuna fisheries, or for other aspects. And so it's about understanding what the drivers are of different parties, and how the sharks can actually offer them solutions in other areas as well. So engaging on sharks could benefit other areas.
I think that kind of last point there is that it impacts on other fisheries, is that it's not just meetings that you attend that are about sharks. You kind of have to look at the whole
Yeah.
picture like all of these species, commercial species, because they're all going to impact sharks in different ways.
A country's opinion, or a country may be having a debate with another country about a certain species that's not a shark or a ray, and that might be influencing the willingness of that country to support something else. So there's a lot of trading off as well, and I really encourage people not just to look at the very focused issue, but you do need to look at that whole landscape and where that focused issue that you're interested in sits in that wider landscape, because there will be so many other influencing factors. And I'm not saying that it will solve the frustration. We've come forward with the clearest scientific case for Mako, for example, in ICAT. It was so clear. The advice was, zero mortality in the North Atlantic. And yet you'll get pushback from countries, and you're there going, you say you follow scientific advice, and yet you're pushing back against this when it's clearly evident that this is what is required. And it doesn't appease the frustration that you feel in those circumstances, but at least, for me at least, it puts things into context to understand what the wider drivers are. But it also then, if you can work with your colleagues to find routes to offset those arguments, you might be able to make progress. And so, we're really fortunate and privileged. We work with some phenomenal people, some of our trusted partners, and the things we've learnt from them over the years have strengthened and bolstered what we do remarkably. And, we are really lucky on that front. Collaboration with key trusted partners is so key. So, yeah, never feel that you shouldn't be able to reach out to other people and engage them in a process and then acknowledge them for that as well. So, yeah.
No, that sounds amazing. And with that kind of, so the RFMOs, so like ICAT, it's this fisheries management, it's doing it kind of at sea at the point of which the sharks are caught. But there are other aspects of shark conservation that you have input in. Did you want to talk about some of the other work? Because your work is obviously so vast, so broad. Some of the other elements as well that feature in that.
Well, I mean, I've been really, really lucky over the years to have worked with a whole host of different projects, a whole host of different sea areas and people, from our partners across the Mediterranean working on angel sharks, guitar fishes, really privileged to work with some of the organisations across North Africa and throughout the Mediterranean, where, again, some of the issues there are really fundamental. Which species are being caught where, in what quantities, how can the existing, because there's, in many places, there's a lot of existing regulation that needs to, or recommendations from these regional bodies that needs to then be transposed into national legislation, so that can be implemented through the countries. And, that sounds like something that should just happen, but, there are so many factors in play, and the decisions that are made in one meeting may be made by, say, one ministry, like the Environment Ministry, and then need to be implemented by the Fisheries Ministry. And you could think, well, if they're in the same country, surely that's an easy thing to achieve. But you'll often find these ministries are disjointed in their approach, and it's true across so many countries. And so that there's a great deal of effort that needs to go forwards, working with local organisations on achieving that change, achieving that legislative change, working with the fishermen. So a lot of our partners do a lot of workshops with the local fishing industry, explaining to them certain, which species are prohibited, how they can handle them, how we can work together to improve the survival of these species, and then hopefully see recovery. And the end point in a lot of this work is populations that could recover to a level at which then a managed take could be permitted. Again, as I said before, this isn't possible for all species, but for some, it's an essential move. We work on issues to do with CITES, so that's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and on CMS, which is the Convention for Migratory Species. And we're a cooperating partner to the CMS Sharks MOU. So where we see our fit in these international wildlife treaties, which are supported by so many conservation organisations, we tend to see our fit in the implementation processes of that. So, you can have wildlife protection or migratory species protection, but those species are still going to encounter fisheries. And so we see it as that sort of nexus of the two issues of the conservation, the wildlife prohibitions or listings, and then how that aligns with the fisheries, and to make the two work in a complementary fashion so that we can actually reduce mortality to levels that are sustainable for that species. And so there's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of different levers that can be used. And it's almost that sort of, aligning all of these issues so that we can then have the best impact for those species. And I think for some countries this can seem quite daunting. There's this ever increasing list of species, of obligations, of commitments. But what we also work to do is say, hey, there's a world of organisations out there, of conservation groups, of research community who can assist in this, and they're ready and willing to help deliver on these commitments and to help countries, stand up to their obligations. And it's important that countries are held to account. You can sit in a meeting and say yes and get something listed, but countries then need to follow through. And we feel that if we have worked to get something into a protective status, we then have a responsibility for taking it beyond that.
And kind of on that kind of subject of working so hard to kind of get these protections in and then making sure those are followed up, do you want to talk about any of the work that you and some of your partners have done in kind of looking into that kind of recently you did the gap analysis?
So yes, through work with our colleagues in the Shark League, we've been looking at a gap analysis. So it's quite a common approach to a gap analysis: what's working, what isn't working, and we've been looking at ICAT parties and species in conjunction with CITES listings and trade, and seeing how different countries have actually implemented the listings, what their landings look like, how they're complying with different aspects of that regulation, where their trade is, all of these facets. And it's an enormous piece of work. There were things in there that you would expect to find, certain countries that you'd expect to find discrepancies between different aspects. But then there was also some really fascinating elements, and you start to see the importance of really effective compliance reporting, which is not the most exciting of aspects, but in terms, again, of ensuring implementation of all these great agreements that are made, compliance reporting is really, really important. And so just tightening and improving those processes, simplifying those processes, so parties, the countries to these RFMOs, are reporting the most effective and useful information so that a fully informed position of the impacts on species can be seen and identified. And, again, through this gap analysis process, we identified certain parties who were not as compliant as they might be, and we're now working with them to improve this. So we don't like to just sit here and throw stones. We like to then follow up the processes and say, right, we found this, and we did actually, through the ICAP process, have countries coming to us and saying, oh, we've improved this, or oh, we found this data, we can explain why that discrepancy was there. Misreporting is rife, not only in terms of volumes of shark and ray that are or aren't reported, but also things being reported under the wrong code. So you might say, hey, that country is reporting an awful lot of species X, when actually it's misreporting and it should have been, different species. Or you identify that there are countries where the landings are aggregated, so it's not by species, could be as simple as sharks, skates and rays. And this is particularly prevalent in the Mediterranean, where many countries will say, yes, we're compliant with Mediterranean regulation for this suite of species, and there's over 24 species that are prohibited in the Mediterranean, sharks and rays that are prohibited in the Mediterranean. But if you look at their landings data, it's all aggregated. So my question would be, how can you clearly tell that you're compliant if I can't see what you're actually landing? And again, that's quite a simple thing in terms of acknowledging the aggregated data. It's a bit more complex to report by species. But it's vitally important that species-specific landings contribute, particularly for prohibited species, are contributing into the management process. And aggregated landings mask a whole world of potential issues.
And I think it's a point you made there that you're kind of at these meetings presenting this stuff, and then countries are coming up being like, oh, we've changed this. Like they want you to know that they are making it better. They are.
Yeah. And then it's vital that we acknowledge that as well. So we acknowledge that efforts are being made by countries to improve, and that's also important. So while we don't, while we will call specific countries out, we then have to also be willing to acknowledge where countries make positive effort and change, and that balanced approach. And this is all about integrity. It's all about credibility, accuracy, and part of that long-running persistence with respect, seeking the best application of existing legislation whilst securing new legislation and recommendations as needed.
And I think a point you've told me before as well is that these decisions might be made here. So say the meeting's in November, it still takes time for those things to actually be implemented, to come through and into effect later on as well. Months
or years in some cases, depending on what the situation is. And sometimes you'll have something that's adopted, but it's still subject to more scientific advice or subject to something else. And so rarely does something happen and then there's an immediate effect. And in some circumstances, a decision can be made, and what you're after is a binding decision. And that's a really, really important thing to understand the difference between something that is binding, something that is non-binding. And the news is full at the moment of non-binding agreements, which means many countries have made it known that this is their view on something, but there's actually no legal instrument to deliver that through. So what we're after are binding agreements where a country is legally required to act in a certain way. Now, that still doesn't mean they necessarily will, but it means that there's some comeback. There is some process through which they can be called to account on that. But then you have some circumstances where countries can still take a reservation. So despite a decision being made, a country can still opt out of that situation. That comes with ramifications for them, but they can opt out of that situation. So it's never quite as clean cut and neat as you might hope it would be. Yeah.
We could talk for hours and hours and hours about all of these amazing things, and we will in other episodes. If you had to kind of look back over your kind of career at the Shark Trust, is there one bit that you're super proud of?
I mean, there's been a number of moments, and I'm all for taking an underdog position and striving and pulling out all the stops, and there can be a lot of stops to achieve the positive result that we need. And I think the work that we did with the Shark Alliance was evidence of that. So we ended up with a landslide vote in support of fins naturally attached in the European Parliament, and that was way beyond our expectations. And that was through sheer will of number of partners walking the halls of Strasbourg and Brussels and just pulling in all the votes that we could get. And that was quite an emotional end to a great deal of work. But then you look at things that we've achieved with blue shark, the first international catch limits for a shark in the shape of blue shark in the Atlantic. That's fairly significant, and we were there and we were embedded in that process and securing, most recently things like just the effort and the rebuffs that we got for the scientific advice for MACOs, but we just kept at it and we kept at it, and to then get a result, albeit it was, the prohibition wasn't a standing prohibition. It's still something that needs to be defended. So these things are rarely perfect, if ever, But it's also really important to recognise the positives in those processes whilst still going, yeah, but we need to strive, or we need to keep an eye on. So it's a real sort of mixed emotion that you're like, right, we've secured this, and this is really a great step forwards. But, you know, you can take a breath, but then you need to keep going to either make sure that is implemented or that can be improved. And so it's sort of a never-ending process, but at each step we're trying to improve, and it's incremental. And to do the work that we do in the Shark Trust from an advocacy perspective, it's about having that capacity to persist and to see those wins, because we get knocked back regularly, but you have to just regroup and go back out again and believe in that issue, in the scientific basis for that argument, and that eventually that will come good. And yeah, just polite persistence, and a belief. And, you know, I joke that I nurture this little ball of naive optimism, and without that sort of little nurtured ball of naive optimism that's in a sea of cynicism, going back into that RFMO arena would be really, really challenging, because I have to have this naive belief that we will make those changes, and we have. And, you know, it's important that funding is maintained in fisheries management, that we are enabled, those organisations that work in this sector are enabled to turn up at these fisheries meetings, because if we don't show up and we don't speak up, it could all too easily turn in the other direction. So, that would be one of my pleas, is that funders maintain engagement in fisheries management. Yes, it takes time, and we appreciate that you need to have, the funders need to have a vision of that longer process, but it's essential, it's fundamental to shark conservation going forwards.
I think hearing your little stories, like throughout, I've only been here like a year and a half, but hearing your stories of throughout your career, it's quite inspirational and kind of makes you excited for things to kind of go forward in the future. That is all we've got time for today. So thank you for joining and helping out, and you'll definitely be back here on more episodes to talk about all the other stuff that we're doing at the moment. Thank you for watching and or listening. If you want to learn more about the Shark Trust, you can visit us on our website, where there's a whole host of information and resources at www.sharktrust.org. You can also follow us on social media. We're basically on everything. And yeah, thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe and share. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Hetty. Thanks for listening to the Shark Trust podcast. Did you know that you can support our work protecting sharks and rays? Here's just some of the ways you can help today. Join our community of passionate shark supporters and gain access to exclusive events and content by becoming a Shark Trust member. You can adopt these incredible animals, directly supporting our conservation efforts and research projects. Make a donation today. Every donation makes a huge difference. Your contribution will go towards funding our vital work all across the world. And finally, if you want to get more hands-on, you can take part in our citizen science projects. Your data and observations are invaluable to understanding the world of sharks. Together, we can make a difference. Visit our website to find out more and take action today.